Welcome to the People and Planet podcast, a show all about human health, planetary health, and the links between them. I'm your host, Alya, an integrative nutrition health coach with a master's in environmental sustainability. I spent most of my life exploring these topics, and this podcast is my effort to collect and deliver information from experts to improve the quality of your life and that of our planet. Thank you so much for being here. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Jessica Alana, who is a board-certified integrative and functional medicine practitioner specializing in mold illness, which is also recognized as chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS. Her educational background includes a degree in biomedicine, complemented by additional certifications in naturopathy, empowering her to approach health and wellness holistically. Jessica is not only a clinician, but also a 10 times global public speaker, having captivated audiences through her impactful presentations on health and well-being. I hope you enjoy this conversation as Jessica guides us through the complexities of mold illness and shares her knowledge and insights for a healthier, more vibrant life. Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me today on the People and Planet podcast. I gave a brief introduction before this episode about you, but I would love if you could share a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and what you specialize in.
Hi, Alya. Really nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And so I'm Jessica, and I'm actually a practitioner who specializes in mold illness, otherwise known as sick building syndrome or chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So the technical name in the peer-reviewed papers is chronic inflammatory response syndrome, but it can be called sick building syndrome or mold illness.
Could you explain why it's called sick building illness?
Essentially the mold illness, it's when an individual has a defect in the human leukocyte antigen gene, and they're exposed to the biotoxin known as mycotoxins in a sick building. So a sick building is anything that is classified as water damaged. So any building that has been damaged by water. Now this water then allows for the colonization of mold. The mold then produces mold toxins, which is mycotoxins. So obviously if you live in that building, you get sick. So it's called sick building syndrome or sick building illness.
Is it all kinds of mold, or is it this famous or infamous, rather, black mold that we all hear about?
So there's actually thousands of species of mold. Some are not poisonous to humans, but most are. And the famous black mold that people talk about is Aspergillus. But there's so many molds like Penicillium, Stachybotrys, Fusarium, and they can all cause this sick building syndrome or mold illness.
And so is this impacting any and all buildings, regardless of climate, regardless of location? If you have a leak, you are susceptible to mold and mold illnesses?
So basically the CDC actually suggests that around 70% of all buildings worldwide are water damaged. So it kind of depends on the architecture of the building. So was it built with drywall? That's a big thing in Northern America, which is why mold illness is pretty common in Northern America. But the one point I'd really like to make is that it's not everyone. So not everyone is going to enter the sick building and get sick. It's only around 25% of the population that has a defect in the human leukocyte antigen gene. So it's this combination of defective innate immune system response with a biotoxin called mycotoxins that causes the illness, okay? So it's 1 in 5 people.
So it's only 20% of the population that is impacted by mold. Why is it then that all of us are worried about mold in our buildings?
I mean, it's kind of gross. to have mold. Like if you go into a home and you see mold growing on the wall, it's kind of connotated with not good hygiene. I also think that mold and mold illness has kind of become in vogue. So Jordan Peterson actually did a podcast with Dr. Richie Shoemaker the other day, who was the discoverer of this illness. I mean, having mold inside a home, it's just generally not very good. It's even spoken about in the Bible. God actually says if you need to be very careful if there's mold in the home. But only this certain group that have the HLA defect need to be worried about having the chronic inflammatory response syndrome.
So if we don't have this defect, as you call it, then we're immune to the black mold that we've all kind of learned to be nervous about?
I wouldn't necessarily say immune. If you don't have the defect, you can still have some acute issues. So maybe acute asthma while you're in the exposure, maybe some acute sinus issues. But once you leave the exposure, your body should normalize. However, saying that, if if anyone enters a building and the concentration of black mold is extremely high, then it can make you sick. It can make you feel poisoned. So there's it's more about the variable of concentration, and then also being in the exposure if you don't have the defect.
That's so interesting because as a health coach, I've come across a lot of, literature and material around mold and mycotoxins and black mold. And I just never heard that it only impacts 20% of people. But as you say, it's just not healthy for anyone to be exposed to it. So it's really interesting to hear you say that. Could you please share with us what some of the symptoms of mold could be like for someone who's infected, and like maybe also explain what to look out for in a home?
Yeah, so symptoms, there's actually around 35 very common symptoms, and they exist in 13 different clusters. So mold illness is known as a multi-symptom, multi-system illness. So it's actually pretty difficult to pinpoint, which is why if you work with a mold practitioner, they will ask you to register your symptoms. And if you have 8 or more symptoms out of the 13 clusters, it's almost certain that you have the multi-system illness. It's actually so the way that the mycotoxin, it basically inhibits protein synthesis and destroys the cell membrane. So because of this, the illness can manifest in 100 different ways. So no case is the same, and the symptoms don't really exist in a vacuum. But you can get some pretty strange symptoms, like electric shocks, metallic taste, frequent urination, migraine headaches, lack of visual acuity, neurological symptoms, anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, joint pain. So it's really, if anyone is listening and they'd like to check out the symptoms, then I advise you to look at the clusters. So if you type in mold illness cluster symptoms, you can basically pinpoint that.
And what should people look out for in their homes just to protect themselves? Yeah.
Yeah, so home, I mean, again, it's tricky. You can have mold living behind the walls, so you'll see no visual signs of mold in the home. I always recommend that you get the ERMI test done, which is Environmental Relative Mold Index. This is the test that's in the peer-reviewed journals. So you have to have a trained professional come to your environment, and they will do a test, and it will show you if the level of mycotoxins and other inflammagens in your environment is high. And then you can begin to connect that to how you feel.
Do you feel that anyone and everyone should do this test, or is it more reserved for people in humid climates or people who live in older buildings versus new buildings? Who would you advise should really get these tests?
I mean, I don't think that the climate impacts necessarily whether your building can become colonized. All you need is water damage for 48 hours and humidity above 45%, and mold can begin to grow. And you need a substrate as well. Like I said, drywall. EMI testing, it's relatively cheap. Okay, so I think it's like maybe $300-400 to have someone come. So it is accessible for people to have. The only problem is when I've worked with clients in Bahrain and some smaller countries, there's no one there to actually do the EMI test. So price-wise, it's okay. Necessarily, I don't think everybody needs to have an EMI test done. If you're into health and wellness and you just want to be sure that you don't have mold, then you can give it a go. But if you're having kind of mysterious symptoms, the doctors have never been able to put their finger on it, it's multi-system, multi-symptom, then yeah, I would say that it's probably in your best interest to get the EMI test done.
The reason I ask is because a lot of my audience, I would say, are based in the Middle East, between Kuwait, Dubai, so the GCC and the Levant, with some people in London or England. And I feel like between the two, it's very different. Like right now I'm in Dubai and this building, I mean, I get my ACs cleaned quite frequently because obviously in Dubai, your ACs could be a real source of mold, and we are using our ACs like 10 months of the year, versus a place like London where, you know, some of those apartments are old build. They were built like around, I don't know, decades ago. And so things could be building up or could be over time, like growing behind the walls, as you said, and no one's really done anything about it. And there could be leaks from heaters and things like that, versus, and the climate's different. So that's why it's like interesting to know if that has any impact versus, you know, a country that's more AC forward, maybe newer builds. And if maybe there's any advice you have for people who live like in the Middle East who are using a lot of AC units.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you should always get your AC cleaned. Mold loves to grow in the AC. And even if you don't have the HLA defect, constantly, you know, recirculating mycotoxins via the AC, it can decrease your baseline level of health. So yeah, I would definitely say have your AC cleaned.
But there's no real difference between like buildings, you know, in different climates or different types of buildings. You're just saying that if there was a leak for more than 48 hours, that is already a red flag and something to investigate, no matter where you live.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Okay.
It's water damaged building is a classification in the literature, in the peer-reviewed journals. So it's got a definition. And within the definition, it doesn't talk about how old a building is or where the climate is. It just talks about this variable of 48 hours of water damage, a substrate, and humidity.
Okay. When you talk about the symptoms that you listed, are these symptoms treatable?
Yes. Yeah, mold, it's treatable. It's treatable.
Do you know anything about the treatment of what it would take to help someone detoxify from mold exposure?
Yeah, of course. So this is the majority of the work that I'm doing with my clients. Typically, my kind of protocol is based off of Dr. Shoemaker. So I trained with him, and he actually wrote all of the peer-reviewed journals. So I really respect his work. But at the same time, I do add in like peptide therapy, phospholipid membrane therapy, supplements, gut therapy, hormonal therapy. Typically, I'm working in 3 different phases. So phase 1 is maybe 4 to 6 weeks of up ramping. Phase 2 is majority Dr. Shoemaker, so some cholestyramine, some binders, maybe antifungals. And stage 3 is reboot and repair. So you work on the nervous system and some of the downstream issues that mold has caused in the process. So that's typically how I work. But every practitioner, has their own magic touch, you could say.
So it would typically take a couple of weeks or a couple of months to fully detoxify from the exposure to the mycotoxins, would you say?
I would say minimum 3 months. I typically work 6 weeks, minimum 3 months. I do have clients who I've been with for 1 year. And I do have clients who have been in the mold world for 5 years, overcoming everything. It depends on, who the person is, how sensitive they are. I know people within the community who've been overcoming this for 10 years. So it kind of depends on the pace at which the person wants to go, and some other variables too.
Do you have any advice that you can give to somebody who suspects that they've had, exposure to mold, they're not feeling good, they have a doctor that might not be a functional doctor, or maybe they're on the lookout for a functional practitioner? Like, any advice for the everyday person who might not have access to the Schumacher method that you're talking about to just, get them moving in a direction, to help them, like, either detect if they have mold or to help them heal if they don't have access to somebody like you?
Yeah, so obviously you have to qualify for treatment, whether that's self-treatment or working with someone. So how do you do this? You have to take a diagnostic tool. In the mold community, there's two diagnostic tools. The first one is a mycotoxin urine panel. So this is when we're detecting the amount of mycotoxins in your urine. Okay. Dr. Shoemaker, he does not agree with this panel at all. Dr. Neil Nathan and Dr. Brewer, they developed this panel along with some labs, and they highly recommend this panel. And I'll explain why. So the second panel is the full SIRS panel. So this is looking at HLA. It's also looking at C4A, MMP9, alpha MSH, VIP. So the full panel, and this is what is preferred by Dr. Shoemaker. So in the USA, you can typically get this panel on your insurance or relatively inexpensive. Outside of the USA, this standard SIRS panel is very expensive in comparison to the mycotoxin urine panel. So for a lot of people, it's inaccessible when they're outside the USA to take the full SIRS panel, and the urine panel is actually a good point for them to start. Personally, I like to use the mycotoxin panel, and then, the client can make their own choice whether they'd like to invest in the full SIRS panel. But for me, a mycotoxin panel is enough to qualify for treatment, and I would say it's enough to self-treat too.
So is this initial urine panel something that anyone could go to their general practitioner and ask about as a first step? They already have their doctor, they already have their GP, or is it not as accessible? They have to find a functional practitioner to help them with this? I'm just thinking about the everyday person who's like, oh, maybe I am exposed to mold, and let me just go to the doctor that has been treating me for, decades, or has known my history as a child, and let me just go ask him or her. And so I'm just trying to think about those people who are not as well versed in the functional or in the alternative medicine route as we are, and how to help them just kind of investigate or start this process.
Yeah, so the mycotoxin panels, they are patented technology, and the labs exist in the USA. So you can't go to your local hospital or GP and expect them to run the mycotoxin panel. Most of the time, they don't have the lab skills or the information to do this. So that's not to say that you can't ask your GP to order the panel for you. If you have a close relationship with the GP, they can possibly sign up to a practitioner's account, and order the mycotoxin panel for you. So there are different ways to access it, but it's not like your average hospital by any means is going to have the mycotoxin panel available.
So step one is to ask your GP if they can order it. And if that's not possible, then another step one could be getting in touch with a local functional practitioner, because they will always have access to some form of mycotoxin testing, correct?
GPs in the US tend to be a little bit more versed. But in the Middle East, I think you would be reliant more on a functional medicine practitioner.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Middle East. I'm thinking about Europe, and what they can do. So that's really helpful. Thank you. When we think about mycotoxins, again, in my field, when I'm, talking to clients about lifestyle, about diet, we do think about, as you call it, sick buildings. But I also talk about mold from nuts or from food or legumes or coffee. Is that something we can unpack together as a potential threat to somebody's health?
So the likelihood that you will become chronically inflamed and sick from consuming moldy nuts and moldy food is relatively low. Okay. So, yeah. So, it is from water damaged buildings. If someone is like already sick and they consume a piece of moldy food, it's going to aggravate the symptoms that they already have. But if you actually look at like the long-term inflammatory process, you'd have to consume a lot of moldy nuts and moldy coffee to have this like multi-system, multi-symptom illness, right? So it is a good strategy to avoid moldy food and moldy coffee and so forth. But it is important to know that it is the water damaged building and the constant inhalation that is the main needle driving the illness.
It's amazing to hear you say that, because, in the health and wellness spaces with all the biohackers, everyone is talking about mycotoxins in coffee and in your berries and in your beans and your nuts. So it's really interesting to hear you say. When you talk about being exposed to that type of food for a long period of time, is it as simple as I found my favorite coffee? It is a moldy coffee, but I'm unaware of it. And that's the coffee. I have 2 cups of it every single day for months or years on end. Will that make me sick, or is that still too low of a dose to really be concerned?
I mean, so in a normal individual without the HLA defect, if they're constantly consuming this coffee, I mean, it'd have to be, first of all, you'd have to understand how many mycotoxins are in the coffee. If it's like super high, then they may feel bad for that day, but then someone who's health conscious should be able to connect the dot that, oh, this coffee is making me feel like really bad. Could it make them chronically sick? Maybe. Someone with HLA, if they're constantly consuming moldy coffee, then it's going to make them sicker than the person without the HLA. But again, in my framework, I tend to focus on water damaged buildings. This is what the literature says, and this is what I know makes people sick. So it's good to, who wants to consume moldy food? Like, it's gross, right? But it's not the same as living in a water damaged building. That's all I can say.
It's not the same exposure. Do you know anything about peanuts? Because everyone's talking about either mold in peanuts or this very specific type of fungus, I think it is, in the peanuts, and how detrimental it is to our health and how it causes all this inflammation, more so than like other types of nuts.
Yeah, I know that there must be a certain protein inside the peanut which allows for the fungus to grow, the mold and fungus to grow. or maybe the packaging and the processing. There is the possibility that if you do consume a large amount of these foods, that you can have a colonization of mold in your gut. It was once believed that mold didn't colonize and that it was just the inhalation or the mycotoxins just being recirculated in the body that caused the illness. However, more and more case studies and research is saying that within the gut microbiome, just like Candida, you can have these species of mold now colonizing there. So perhaps when you eat the peanut, it allows the mold species to colonize. So that's another option to explore. But when you work with someone on mold, they should be addressing this whole picture.
Got you. Another question around food, especially berries, because I get this a lot. When you go to the supermarket and you get a box of berries and then it stays in your fridge, and then after 2 days, only one shows this like fluffy mold on it. I've learned over, studying and listening to microbiologists that if there's one moldy anything in a container, the whole thing has been infected. So you don't just like chop off that part of the bread that's moldy and continue to eat the rest of the bread, or you don't just take out that moldy berry and continue eating the rest of the berries. If all those berries were in the same container exposed to that one moldy berry, the whole thing has been infected. Is that true?
I would say so. I think because of the way that the mold spores are picked up in the air and so forth. So one moldy berry, just because the mold isn't growing on other berries, doesn't mean that there's not mycotoxins and mold spores on other berries. So yeah, I would say that's correct.
Okay, great. I love that we busted that myth because I get into a lot of conversations about it. You mention the HLA genotype quite a bit, and you say that it impacts 20% of people, and they're the ones that are more susceptible, more sensitive to mold issues and symptoms. How does one test if they are of this HLA genotype or if they've got this defect?
Yeah, it's pretty easy. It's a swab, so mouth swab, just like how you do 23andMe, just like how you do any other genome testing. Working out, so the readout of HLA is difficult. So it's not like they say, okay, yes or no. It's like you have to work out the genotype. You have to do a very specific Rosetta Stone equation and look at the different alleles. So I mean, the average person, if they do get this test done, they may need to work with someone and have that someone interpret the test.
Okay. Otherwise, we can just go to a doctor or somebody who does genetic tests and ask for an HLA test.
Yes, I mean, again, it's pretty rare. The local hospital tend to not do the HLA. They do it with LabCorp in the USA. And I know I know 2 labs really in the EU, which serve my clients in Dubai and also UK and EU too. So if anyone does want to get it done. But it's this specific allele will not be on your 23andMe, actually.
Okay. So again, functional practitioners are probably the best way to get this test done.
I would say so. I mean, it's just about, if someone knows about mold and they're a capable practitioner, capable doctor, I think that's all that matters. But it's just not so common. It's just not so commonly known.
Okay. Do you have any surprises that show up in your practice when you're working with clients who are infected with mold? And
Yes. So some of my male clients, they have testosterone issues from mold. They have very high estrogen and very low testosterone, which impacts a lot of things. This did surprise me a lot in the beginning, but now I've seen it's very common.
what are the implications of that, and why is that happening?
So in mold, you get a huge reduction in alpha MSH, which is a very critical neuroregulatory peptide in the brain. And alpha MSH is basically one of the master regulators of the entire hormonal axis. So downstream of that, you get very low testosterone. At the same time, mycotoxins are actually xenoestrogens. So they act on estrogen receptors in the cell and actually mimic estrogen. Mycotoxins also increase aromatase enzyme. So you get more conversion of all of the other hormones into estrogen. So you get this huge disbalance.
And so how does that present itself for men? I can guess, but it would be interesting for you to, share that with us.
I think, psychologically, a lot of the men feel that they don't have a heroic mission as a man. They don't have the drive. At the same time, I do have some clients that their voice has changed. So they don't
Wow.
have that deep masculine voice. They feel more feminine in terms of their emotions. I mean, it's hard for me to quantify because I'm a lady, but I think it just mimics having low testosterone. So whatever that looks like to the guy. And then of course when it comes to romantic relationships, it can also trickle over too.
So that could look like low energy, low libido, impact on their fertility. Does it have any physical symptoms in the way that they distribute fat in their body? I heard that, if you have low testosterone, high estrogen, you kind of compact the fat around the hips. Are they developing fat in the chest? Like, does it have any physical manifestations as well?
Yeah, of course. So the man will find it difficult to lose body fat, and then the body fat will have the composition, yeah. Like how a lady does. We develop our fat around our bum and our hips and our boobs. So yeah, you'll see this in men with mold too. And it's very hard for them to lose the weight. Very hard.
And is it a very similar protocol in the sense that when they start working with you, they'll see a change in like 3, 4, 5 months? Their testosterone rises and they feel like they've come back to themselves as the men that they know them to be?
Yeah, so the hormonal issues, they're normally the last thing. So it's like a domino. So the hormonal issues are considered to be downstream. And they're normally not one of the last, but they can take a little while to reboot. But I've actually seen men who have tried to use exogenous testosterone and some other drugs. And this actually makes it very hard then to reboot the whole testosterone symptoms. If you have mold, please do not use any form of exogenous TRT.
Okay, can you explain what that is? Is that a form of hormone replacement therapy?
Yeah, so it's injecting testosterone basically.
And why is that so bad to do? Because intuitively it feels like if you're low in testosterone, why can't I just inject testosterone? But you're saying it makes it worse. So what's actually happening?
So you're going to cause a lot of confusion to the hormonal axes. And at the same time, the majority of that testosterone is going to be converted into estrogen by aromatase.
Oh, so it'll just amplify the whole problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you see this with women too, where they're having high estrogen or estrogen dominant symptoms if they're exposed to mold? So an increase in weight gain or an increase in fibroid development or mood disorders. Are you seeing it with women too?
I do. Yeah, a lot of women lose their periods. They have very irregular cycles and they do have estrogen dominance. There's actually a movie called moldymovie.com by Dr. Shoemaker. I advise everyone to watch this, and you will, there's people in there who are obviously, they're being recorded and they're very open about their experiences. And there's one lady in the movie and you can see how estrogen dominant she is by the extreme weight gain that she had.
Okay, I'm going to link that below so people have access to that. Speaking again on symptoms, you said that, mold can also just start to grow and populate in extreme ways in the gut. how does that impact us or impact the gut-brain axis?
Yeah, so the way that, well, obviously you'll have leaky gut. You'll have extreme leaky gut because the mold will basically use its tentacles and create colonization within the gut. The gut-brain axis in mold is almost completely destroyed because you have low alpha MSH, low VIP. So both of these really regulate the gut. You also have leaky blood-brain barrier too. That whole axis in mold is very, very hard to repair because it's all to do with the alpha MSH. So this is where I like to use a lot of peptides.
What is alpha MSH? And could you explain to people what peptides are exactly and how they help to heal this process?
Yeah, so alpha MSH is a neuroregulatory peptide in the brain. And it basically controls leaky gut, it controls the hormonal axis. It's incredibly important for anti-inflammatory, for endorphins, and for pain. And this is an oversimplification of what alpha MSH does. And peptides are one of my favorite therapies. So peptides are basically well-structured, well-organized amino acids between 4 and 50 in chain length. So I like to use peptides a lot.
Do you have any advice or any tips that you can share with people who they think have been exposed to mold?
Yes, I would say get tested. So you have to either open that door and walk through it or shut the door. If you do have long-term chronic illness and no one has actually been able to give you a conclusion about what is going on, just test for mold. It's low risk and it's high reward. You'll know what's going on.
Amazing. Jessica, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being here and sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom on mold. Can you share with people where they can find you online or any links or websites where people can connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So I have my website, jessicaalana.com, which we'll link. And I'm also posting a lot of very good scientific information on my Twitter and my Instagram. So I'm posting high-level information about mold, all the study links too, on my Twitter and Instagram. So if you'd like to do a little dive on my social media, you can do so. On my website, I have very good explanations about what mold illness is, and also I have my success stories too. So you can actually read each success story and see how I've worked with people.
Amazing. And if people want to get in touch with you, they can do it via your website?
Yeah, I have a contact form on my website and also my email, jessica@jessicaalana.com.
Great.
Or DM me.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll link everything below. And again, Jessica, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Please share with family and friends that you feel could benefit from this episode, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and review to support the show. Check out the links below for more information about my guests and where to find them. And make sure you're following me on Instagram at wholesome_practice to learn more about what I do. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you on the next one. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should never replace the advice of your doctor or physician. Always consult a medical professional before making any changes or adding anything new to your diet, lifestyle, or medication protocol.